Nation responds to the coronavirus pandemic. Many are looking for lessons from past outbreaks. Joining us right now is Richard Preston. He is the New York Times bestselling author of The Hot Zone, also the new book that's out, Crisis in the Red Zone, the story of the deadliest Ebola outbreak in history and of the outbreaks to come. Richard, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Hot Zone scared me to death, but you chronicled in such an amazing way how these outbreaks can take place, what happens, and what we need to do next. I'm guessing this pandemic didn't come as a huge surprise to you.
It didn't. Actually, some of the experts I've been talking with, as much as 25 years ago, predicted that a big pandemic could occur with coronavirus. This has been on the radar screen of some experts for quite some time.
What is so significant about coronavirus? Why is it so deadly to humans and so dangerous?
Well, I'll tell you, it's because nature, in the first place, nature is full of viruses. Everything on the planet that lives, from bacteria to blue whales, gets infected with its own kinds of viruses. Coronaviruses live in many kinds of animals out there in nature. Just for example, bats in China and in Central Asia, that's the type of animal from which we think this new coronavirus came from originally. There are thought to be around 5,000 different bat coronaviruses out there. And these things, they give a bat a runny nose. It's not a big deal. It's basically a bat cold. But viruses have a tendency to jump species. They find a new host. And right now on the planet, there are 7.5 billion people. We represent an enormous new unexplored host for these viruses. And this coronavirus pandemic is the third major outbreak of a coronavirus to occur in the human species. And there will be certainly more. We hear some people saying, well, this is a once in a 100-year event. It is absolutely not. It is part of a pattern of emerging viruses coming out of the world's ecosystems and finding their way into the human species, and then, as we now see, can do incredible damage. And there will be more in the future. There are going to be further pandemics. We don't know when. We don't know what it will be. Maybe another coronavirus, maybe something else. But what we do know, or what we can see, is that the human species packed together in these enormous super cities with populations of 20 million or more. And New York, greater New York, is an example of that. It's got a population of about 20 million. So you take, the population of Texas, most of it, you pack it into one city. And what you have is a kind of a petri dish or a breeding ground for a huge outbreak. And I think the major thing that we're taking away from this pandemic is that pandemic and public health are now a matter of national security.
Yeah, hey, Richard, it's frightening. It is. And even swine flu, I think, was, 500, almost 600,000 people killed. Do we take any solace that maybe if the mortality rate is too high, it's self-defeating for the virus? I mean, if it was... I can only imagine if this were Ebola and it was 50% fatality or something like that, how frightening it's frightening enough, obviously, what we're seeing right now, and deadly enough. But do viruses that are much more fatal, do they have a hard time if the host dies and they're unable to spread, or do we have to worry about something that could be 10 times worse than this someday?
Well, unfortunately, I think we do have to think about all possibilities. If you get a lawyer, the lawyer is there to think about worst case scenarios and to try to protect you from them, even if they don't occur, because sometimes they do. And I think a worst case scenario could be worse than coronavirus. You could have a higher fatality rate. And there's evidence that viruses in the short term can really be extremely deadly and also spread fast. So a host population can get cut down by a large amount. I think that we're not without our defenses. And one of the most important defenses that we have actually is as humans, we have altruism, kindness, and an ability to work with teams and to self-sacrifice. And we're seeing that right now with, I think, fundamentally heroic work of medical care workers across the United States. They are doing incredible and sort of amazing job of just carrying on in the face of danger and great difficulty. And that includes regular workers who work in nursing care facilities and retirement communities. You know, they're putting themselves in harm's way to protect us. But I think with a pandemic like this, any crisis also brings opportunities. And we have an opportunity here, I think, to get focused on the real situation of the human species on the planet right now with regard to these viruses. They are clearly a threat, but we can do things to deal with it. And one thing that I think is going to be essential is that nations around the world, starting with the United States, really have to develop a series of platforms for rapidly developing vaccines and new kinds of antiviral drugs, which can be done. It's very feasible. And then in addition to that, we have to develop surge manufacturing capability. The ability, we're going to have a coronavirus vaccine at some point in the next 12 to 18 months. But the real question is, can we make enough of it to make a difference? And that's where surge manufacturing of these new kinds of drugs and vaccines is going to be a critical part of the process.
Hey, Richard, you mentioned the workers who are really throwing themselves into the fray with this, those on the front lines, those healthcare workers who are taking great personal risk to try and keep the rest of us safe. What do you think when you see people who are ignoring social distancing rules, flocking on the beaches, hanging out with friends in parks, obviously not following the directions that we've been given?
Well, I wrote about the great Ebola epidemic in Africa a few years back. And when Ebola first broke out in villages and then quickly got into the cities, an awful lot of regular people didn't believe that Ebola was real. They felt that it was a hoax, and in any case, wasn't that serious. People didn't really pay attention. But then when the virus got into their homes and into their communities and they began seeing its effects, they woke up fast. When your life is at stake, you get smart really fast. And in Africa, what happened was, and I'm sure it's going to happen in the United States, that when people finally realize that this thing is real and it's a real threat, they're going to absolutely go to social distancing. This happened in Africa. And when regular people just kind of woke up to the reality of it, West Africans went hardcore for social distancing. And I mean, it was quite harsh. For example, nobody would touch anybody who looked sick out in public. Second, people even engaged in social distancing within their own families. So it was the hardest thing you can imagine. If a child in a family broke with Ebola, the parents had to force themselves to give the child to one of these camps with white tents, to take the child out of the family to save the lives of everyone else in the family. But they would give their child over to a camp with the likelihood that they would never see their child again. And yet they did it. And it stopped Ebola.
Hey, Richard, we don't have a lot of time left, but I'm just trying to figure out all the things we can do. Now, not all these viruses have the same, they don't come from the same places, obviously. But do you think that maybe wet markets really need to be looked at? You mentioned that bats get these viruses and they get a cold. Is it easier to jump to humans if you're eating these exotic things? Would it help to shut the wet markets, or the viruses will just be generated in some other fashion?
Yes, unfortunately, it would really help to shut the wet markets. If, in fact, the Chinese government, with all its powers, could do that. What happens in China, unfortunately, is that things go underground really fast. And it's not just a matter of government action in China to shut down the wet markets, but it's also convincing the people who go to these wet markets and buy the meat that this is dangerous for them. Now, these bat viruses, these coronaviruses, they leak out into the population of China every now and then. But in the old days, villages that were situated near bat caves, scientists have discovered that there are lots of people living in these villages that show signs of having been infected with some sort of coronavirus. Probably not the one that's sweeping around the world right now, but there's just a lot of traffic. There's a lot of cross-species jumping when viruses go from animals to people right around them. And it's not just happening in China. It's happening everywhere humans are in contact with wild animals. And you can think of lots of places where that occurs. But in the old days, a virus would, it wouldn't get into a lot of people. I mean, it would be an isolated place. Some people would get sick, and then it would kind of smolder away and die out. But today, we have two things going on in the human species that have never happened before in history. The first is the packing factor. More than half of the people on the planet now live in cities, close together, where something can spread easily, like a match thrown into a barn full of hay. And then secondly, we have the mixing factor, and that is rapid travel by airlines. So last year, 4.5 billion there were 4.5 billion passenger trips on airlines in the world. And think about the human population basically being thrown into some kind of gigantic blender and being stirred up by airline travel, so that if a virus gets anywhere, it's quickly going to get mixed into the human population all around the planet. These are two things that are really facilitating these outbreaks. And I think that as time goes forward, we're going to see more of them, and they're going to balloon faster.